So I see my purpose tonight as helping you connect just a bit more with the music that you're about to hear. As a musicologist, I want to give you some context for the works, where they fit in time, relative to both historical events as well as other composers and works that you might know. I want to give you some background on the pieces, both what they're about and particularly how they connect with other arts. Lastly, I want to give you some ideas about things to listen for later this evening. So, fair warning, I'm going to throw a lot of names and ideas at you. And maybe you'll recognize every single reference, but do not worry if you miss several of them. My aim is to help you connect something new with something you might already know. And my students have told me that this approach I have of just kind of throwing references out there has helped them in cocktail hours and trivia nights, so there's that, maybe you'll get that benefit. But there's no quiz at the end, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for me to answer questions. If I go over in time, which, again, my students say I sometimes do, feel free to look me up on University of Michigan's website and email me things, even if you want to call me out and show me how much you know. I'm more than happy to read that. So here's the big question for tonight. What is French music? What is it exactly that makes music French? The first composer, chronologically speaking, is César Franck, and we immediately have a problem. César Franck was born in 1822 in Liège. So in 1794, Liège was taken by the French army, but France lost the city in 1815 to the Netherlands as part of the Congress of Vienna's attempt to establish a lasting peace after the Napoleonic Wars. During Franck's childhood, so in 1830 to be precise, the Belgian Revolution led to the formation of a new independent nation. So, if Franck was born under Dutch rule, but in what became Belgium, is he French? His mother was of German ancestry, and his father was initially from a town near the German border. But Liège is located in the largely francophone region called Bologna. A musical prodigy, César Franck was initially trained in the Liège Conservatoire, but his family relocated to Paris in 1835 in hopes of enrolling César in the prestigious Paris Conservatoire. He was initially turned away because, get this, he wasn't French. But his determined father was able to get the necessary naturalization documents so he could enroll in 1837. Despite preparing with composition classes for the career-making Prix de Rome, Franck never actually competed for it. And despite his future career as a preeminent organist and his eventual tenure as the professor of organ at the Paris Conservatoire, he never won top honors in the organ class either. He withdrew from the Conservatoire in 1842. Gradually, though, Franck earned a reputation as a composer and as an organist. After a couple less prominent positions, his first major organ post was at Saint-Clotilde in 1858, and thanks to his formidable skills as an improviser, he was named professor of organ at the Paris Conservatoire in 1872. In order to take that job, though, he became a French citizen, so voila, he's French, right? So French, in fact, that his Opus 1 No. 2, the Trio de Salon, was featured in the first concert of the Société Nationale de Musique, the National Music Society, an organization dedicated to promoting French music. For much of the 19th century, since the reformation of French society after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, the music education system was designed to prepare composers and musicians for jobs in the state theaters, rather than working for churches or wealthy noble patrons as they had before the Revolution. These state theaters needed incidental music for plays, but they also needed operas. French grand opera was the preeminent musical genre in the mid-19th century, but composers like Camille Saint-Saëns wanted to open opportunities for instrumental music. After the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, this is the 1870-1871 conflict, the desire to challenge Austro-Germanic cultural hegemony in the absolute instrumental music forms, like the symphony and string quartet, provided the necessary support for the formation of the Société Nationale de Musique. The work we will hear tonight, the Chausseur maudit, or the Accursed Huntsman, was also premiered by the Société Nationale de Musique in 1883. Franck describes it as a poème symphonique, or symphonic poem, a genre that dates back to the Hungarian composer Franz Liszt. Symphonic poems most often belong to a category we call program music, music that will tell a story, but they combine their storytelling qualities with the formal rigor of a symphony. In many cases, musical themes will be paired to elements from the story, and those themes will be developed using sophisticated compositional techniques, but in ways that match the extra musical narrative. Franck's piece draws from the ballad Der wilde Jäger, or The Wild Hunter, by Gottfried August Berger, an 18th century German poet. In short, a nobleman decides to go hunting on a peaceful Sunday morning. Franck begins the work with his hunting horns, but they're interrupted by church bells, as we'll hear in this example. The bells, along with the pious strains of devout worshippers, warn the nobleman against hunting on the Lord's Day, but he is not deterred. Eventually, the nobleman finds himself alone, his horse refusing to continue and his hunting horn no longer able to sound, and he hears a voice curse him to be eternally chased by hell. The hunter is then pursued by demons, during the day through the abyss, at midnight through the air. I won't spoil the music for you. Franck's masterful composition will speak for itself. In much of Franck's mature music, we can hear the counterpoint of a preeminent organist improviser, a command of the classical forms, as well as the embrace of romantic harmonic language. In short, to the well-honed ear, we can hear the influence of Bach, of Beethoven, of Liszt, and of Wagner. Franck's reputation as a composer was so great that his organ classes at the Conservatoire were not so secretly considered composition classes by his students. And his most devoted disciples even called themselves Franquistes after their master. Among his most dedicated pupils was Vincent d'Indy, a man preoccupied with defining musical Frenchness. At the turn of the century, a political clash became an all-out cultural war for the soul of France. The Dreyfus affair served as a catalyst for the long-simmering conflict, and few artists could escape the politicization of French culture for long. Many of the Franquistes followed Vincent d'Indy in his quest to pattern the French musical aesthetic after their master's style, their sort of French master. And he married that musical language to the politics of the anti-Dreyfusard right. The political right conceived of France based on its tradition, its history, and also its racial identity. There were tendencies to emphasize France's Catholic identity and to disavow foreign influence, leading to various degrees of anti-Semitism and xenophobia. If the Paris Conservatoire can be seen as left at this time, designed according to the ideals and the needs of post-revolutionary France, specifically the French Republic, so you'll see Republican in this context as left, tricky for Americans, I know, emphasizing opera and theater music while teaching composition that focused on these vertical harmonies like chord progressions, d'Indy steered the new Schola Cantorum to be its musical and political opposite, religious rather than secular music. Counterpoint with its horizontal lines as in fugues rather than harmony, and teaching music history rather than just serving the needs and tastes of the present. Vincent d'Indy also influenced the Société Nationale de Musique to promote his version of Frenchness, rejecting works with foreign influence and compositions by composers who were not themselves French. The last straw, however, was d'Indy and the Société Nationale de Musique's rejection of Debussy, which prompted dissenters like Maurice Ravel to form the Société Musicale Indépendante, or the Independent Musical Society, in 1910. Claude Debussy was descended from peasant stock and constantly struggling with finding his place in Parisian artistic life. He endured the trauma of the Franco-Prussian War as a child and received no formal education whatsoever before attending the Paris Conservatoire at age 10 in 1872. Despite not living up to his father's hopes of becoming a virtuosic pianist, Debussy attracted enough acclaim at the Conservatoire to become the musical tutor for Nadezhda von Meck's children. She was a very important patron of Tchaikovsky, and Debussy's appreciation for his music helped him establish rapport with his new employer. He spent multiple summers and autumns with the von Meck family, traveling and learning and ultimately deciding to pursue composition. The contradictions in Debussy's identity begin to emerge during his time at the Conservatoire. Despite his social awkwardness and humble beginnings, Debussy's interactions with the upper classes encouraged the development of sophisticated tastes. Despite his reputation for mischief, he learned to adhere to the rules enough to win the Prix de Rome on his second attempt. Because of his lack of formal education, Debussy was an autodidact in relation to the other arts. In particular, he frequented the salons and bookshops of the symbolists. A French literary movement of the late 19th century, symbolists sought to evoke and suggest rather than describe. The symbols in their works are keys that can be used to unlock a hidden reality, the realm of the most important truths. The burden falls on the artist to point towards those truths, but the burden of the audience is to step forward and actually reach them. To achieve this goal, symbolists questioned the boundaries between the arts and held synesthesia, or the merging of the senses, up as an ideal. As Baudelaire wrote in Correspondance, there are perfumes that are fresh like children's flesh, sweet like oboes, green like meadows, and others corrupt, rich, triumphant, having the expansiveness of infinite things like amber, musk, benzoin, and incense, which sing of the raptures of the soul and senses. These connections between the arts and between the senses help us move past this limited perception and towards a greater one on a higher plane for the symbolists. Particularly in the period up until Debussy's opera Pelléas et Mélisande, there is no greater influence on his work than symbolism. Symbolist poets and the writers they admire fill Debussy's catalog. Pelléas was after the play by Maeterlinck, Fête galante and Ariette oubliée after Verlaine, Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune after Mallarmé, and the 5 poèmes de Baudelaire, to name a few. The quintessentially French Debussy achieved his personal musical language of symbolist suggestion through the inclusion of elements from international sources. The influence of Russian composers extends far beyond Tchaikovsky. Many analysts have noted the influence of Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov on Debussy's masterpiece, Pelléas et Mélisande, for example. And Debussy's appreciation for exotic scales, like the whole tone scale or the octatonic scale, very well seem to have come from Russian examples. Debussy's fascination with Wagner helped him to acquire new harmonic structures and orchestral effects, and his disavowal of Wagner ultimately pushed him to grow beyond Wagner's inventions. At the 1889 Universal Exhibition in Paris, Debussy encountered Javanese gamelan music and was fascinated by what he called its infinite arabesque. He even said that the counterpoint, this is his quote, "counterpoint beside which Palestrinas is child's play." East Asian music in general may have prompted his embrace of the pentatonic, or the 5-note scale, which is often used by Orientalist French composers after that to denote Asianness. And you'll hear this scale tonight in Nuage. So as you listen tonight to Nocturnes, allow yourself to be led where Debussy suggests and where your senses take you. Hopefully you'll find some enlightenment, or at least be inspired to check out some symbolist poetry. The irony, though, of Ravel and other pro-Debussy folks choosing to separate from the Société Nationale de Musique to form their own club is that Debussy refused to choose sides. True to form, he lived in the tension between. He had Dreyfusard and anti-Dreyfusard friends, so he chose instead to sign the call for unity, hoping they could be reconciled. Despite his sympathy for advocating a French national musical style, his resistance to dogma in general prevented him from blindly accepting Dandy's construction of that French classicism, particularly when he saw that it was ultimately rooted in Austro-Germanic forms. With the advent of World War I, the French president Raymond Poincaré called for a union sacrée, or a sacred union, between the warring political factions so they could face their common enemy together. Because the conservatives were in power, this was ultimately a call for the minority, the left, to cooperate. Musically, this translated to the traditionalists expecting the more progressive camp to adhere to what Vincent d'Indy would consider a pure French classicism in the name of patriotism. Despite some attempts at reconciliation, the Société Nationale de Musique and the Société Musicale Indépendante were not able to reconcile. In 1916, an organization was created to formally prevent the performance of any Germanic music in France during the war, and while many leading musical figures signed on, Maurice Ravel refused to participate. Ravel was born in 1875 in the Basque village of Ciboure to a Basque mother and a Swiss father. His family moved to Paris, but he never forgot his Basque heritage. Like Franck and Debussy, Ravel studied at the Paris Conservatoire, but his educational career was marked by something so spectacular that it came to be known as the Affaire Ravel. Granted, this is actually technically the first Affaire Ravel, because he caused a lot of trouble. Despite 5 attempts, Ravel never won the Prix de Rome. On his 5th attempt, he failed to even progress beyond the first round, and the public was outraged. This was like a massive sporting event back then. People would just come and see, it'd be reported on the paper, and they were incredibly upset. Everyone thought he was a shoo-in. This became a particular problem because he was already successful as a composer in some sense. He was having works premiered by that Société Nationale de Musique. Once it became clear that every single one of the finalists happened to study with the exact same composition teacher, and that composition teacher served on the jury of the competition, the press had a field day with the scandal. It ultimately led to the resignation of Dubois as the director of the Conservatoire. He was replaced by Gabriel Fauré, who learned from the conflict with the Schola Cantorum. He modernized the Conservatoire's curriculum, choosing to include counterpoint, music history, and more instrumental repertoire. If Debussy knew how to play both sides, Ravel is an all-out rebel. Like Debussy, he became fascinated with gamelan music in the Universal Exposition in 1889. He embraced Russian music, and he devoured much of the same literature. Around 1902, he joined a literary musical artistic group called Les Apaches, or the Ruffians. In short, Ravel did not limit himself to the Conservatoire's training, but scoured Paris to design his own curriculum. During World War I, Ravel proved himself to be a patriot. Despite his age, he actually turned 40 during the war. He tried to enlist as a pilot more than once, before ultimately being accepted as a driver in the Motor Transport Corps. Ravel's refusal to cooperate with the calls for unity had nothing to do with patriotism, and everything to do with how he conceived of his country. The France he loved was not conservative and nationalistic, but rather a progressive revolutionary republic, a protector of universal values and individual liberty. After the war, Ravel was firmly positioned within the French left, espousing sympathies for socialism and actively promoting the works of Jewish composers, in contrast with the anti-Semitism of Vincent d'Indy's camp. He was close friends with Madame Fernande Dreyfus and Ida Rubinstein, and he frequented the same salons as Albert Einstein and Stefan Zweig. He reworked his Mélodie hébraïque, or his Hebrew melodies, for voice and orchestra in 1920, and was so frequently in the company of Jewish friends that many people assumed he himself was Jewish. Likewise, he championed the works of Arnold Schoenberg in an anti-Semitic and anti-Austro-Germanic climate, despite the risk to his career in allying with the enemy. In 1927, he even persuaded this new Société Musicale Indépendante to welcome Schoenberg to present his works in 2 separate concerts. At the time, the Société Nationale de Musique would only include composers from outside of France if they were very close political allies with the country. The piece on tonight's program, La Valse, or the Waltz, evidences Ravel's great love for Gustav Mahler, as well as the so-called foreign influences on Ravel's style and his bold rejection of a narrowly defined nationalist French aesthetic. He first conceived of the work in 1906, but he did not have occasion to write it until after World War I. In a transformed world, the work took on new significance. Ravel had originally planned for it to be a poem symphonique entitled Vienne, or Vienna, but when he pitched the idea for it to become a ballet to the impresario Sergei Diaghilev, the man behind The Rite of Spring, Firebird, the Ballet Russe, Diaghilev astutely suggested a name change in the xenophobic climate of post-war Paris. The waltz as a dance, though, is still intimately connected to Imperial Vienna, and Ravel remarked, "I conceived this work as a kind of apotheosis of the Viennese waltz, with which was mingled, in my mind, the impression of a fantastic and fatal whirling. I situate this waltz in the context of an imperial palace around 1855. The eminent cultural historian Karl Schorsky hears in Ravel's La Valse a grotesque memorial to the violent death of the 19th century world. The work begins with fragments of waltzes gradually revealed as if through the mists of history. Accidentally started the next example. So after establishing and reveling in the waltz itself, Ravel begins pushing it towards an increasingly frantic and distorted version of the refined dance, taking his cue from Gustav Mahler and embracing the grotesque. The last work on tonight's concert, Henri Dutilleux's Tout, monde, lointain, or A Whole Distant World, was composed half a century after Ravel's Valse. Dutilleux was born in 1916, in the midst of World War I. As a young child, his family gifted him the score to Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande for his 12th birthday, and his path towards becoming a composer seemed set. In a curious coincidence, a 10-year-old Olivier Messiaen's passion for composition was ignited by the exact same gift. As a young man, Dutilleux emulated Ravel, but he succeeded where his hero failed, winning the Prix de Rome in his third attempt. Now, I've talked about this a bit. So when you win the Prix de Rome, you win a 4-year residency at the Villa Medici in Rome and a full financial support to develop your career and style. In this cloistered environment, the fellowship with your peers who won the prize in the other arts and the incredibly inspiring environment of being there in Rome were intended to serve as a catalyst and a launch pad for a promising career. Dutilleux won the Prix de Rome and left for his residency in February of 1939. He was recalled to Paris and mobilized at the outbreak of World War II. So he really did not get to enjoy that process at all. He served as a stretcher bearer until being demobilized in September 1940, so he actually escaped a lot of the tragedies that befell his contemporaries. The world wars brought a collapse of the institutions that trained and supported the next generation of musicians, so young composers would band together in groups to create their own careers. Les Six for the youth disrupted by World War I, Jeune France in the 1930s, Zodiac in the aftermath of World War II. Dutilleux, however, preferred to remain apart. The preeminent Anglophone scholar of Dutilleux, Caroline Potter, has helped explain his compositions through the lens of literature. Like Debussy and Ravel, Dutilleux was heavily influenced by the French literary tradition. After the model of Proust, and particularly Proust's masterwork In Search of Lost Time, Dutilleux seemed to compose each new work as a furtherance of the ideas that came before, rather than as a discrete new creation on a different subject. So consider these two quotations from Dutilleux. An artist has a very small number of things to say, which are ever emphasized and ever identical. And then Proust, this is from À la recherche du temps perdu, La prisonnière. Thinking again about the unity of Venture, or the composer protagonist, his work, I explained to Albertine that the great writers have only ever written one work, or rather they have never done more than refract through various media an identical beauty which they bring to the world. Like Proust and Debussy, Dutilleux is concerned with memory. If Franck wrote massive cyclical forms with repeated themes to present particular ideas with a capital I from extra musical literary programs, Debussy suggests treating the same theme in slight variation and in different lights and angles and perspectives, pointing towards hidden truths in the merging of the senses and the arts. Ravel's waltz emerges in fragments from the memory of a bygone era, and his themes are repeated but transformed in ways that challenge the jingoistic rhetoric of his contemporaries. Dutilleux, however, uses small cells that are gradually revealed and developed, but he attempts to do so in ways that are more instinctual than analytic. He calls this croissance progressive, or progressive growth. When you're listening to his music, nothing sounds identical, and yet everything sounds familiar. His works are in dialogue with each other, allude to each other without direct quotation, and just deepen his style and examination of the themes of memory and escapism with each successive work. Like Ravel and Debussy, Dutilleux was strongly affected by the work of Baudelaire, and Tout, monde, lointain was based on and includes quotations from poems by Baudelaire. The title comes from this passage: "Languorous Asia and burning Africa, a whole distant world, absent, almost dead, lives in your depths, aromatic forest. As other spirits float on music, mine, my love, swims on your perfume." While these dreams and distant memories seem to be distinctively French, with his musical style correspondingly descended from the symbolism of Debussy, Dutilleux's cello concerto cannot be viewed as purely French. The cello soloist serves as the intermediary between Baudelaire's literary world and the musical one, and the embodiment of the escape towards a higher dream world. And the particular kind of virtuosity he wrote for and used to achieve that effect was inspired by the man who commissioned the work, Mstislav Rostropovich, he commissioned it in 1961 and was the one to premiere it in 1970. I was going to play a bit for you, but you'll hear it very soon in the interest of time. So just in conclusion, what then is French music? If in every one of these quintessentially French pieces we find an international edge, I'd suggest that is precisely what makes French music, a dialogue between all of these international influences, things that came from French colonies, things that came from their neighbors, but refracted through a community of artists living in a particular place and time. Thank you.